So I am going to have to make one little correction to your introduction, which is I'm not a Googler. I'm a partner at OC&C, and I head up the retail practice there. But we have been working very collaboratively with Google, and I've spent many days here and presented at this town hall many times. So quite easy to be mistaken for a Googler. So delighted to be here today, really, and present to you some findings that a joint study that Google and OC&C collaborated on earlier this year. Hopefully this will also be a bit of probably the only presentation of the day that doesn't have a demonstration or a video or doesn't mention the word Nexus or mobile, but hopefully nonetheless gripping. So the genesis for this study really came about when a team of us at Google and OC&C were just talking about what are the big themes and trends we're spending our time working on, what do clients sort of really want to talk to us about. And the two themes that really came about were multi-channel and international. So there's hardly a retail business that we encounter these days that doesn't have those two words on their strategic agenda. And actually, both our businesses were sort of really interested in both themes, but actually more interested at what happens at the intersection of multi-channel and international. Because there's a trend that we're starting to see around how e-commerce and how the internet is really enabling businesses to grow internationally much more rapidly than was ever possible. And we said, actually, this whole phenomenon hasn't really been studied in great detail. So why don't we put some facts and some science and data behind it and try to demystify it for ourselves, but also for an audience like you? Now, the study does take a very sort of retail angle, this particular version of the study, and we are doing subsequent versions that look at sectors such as travel, luxury, and so on. But I have to say, even though a number of you aren't necessarily from the retail sector, a lot of the findings here we think are absolutely pertinent for any business, be it a luxury brand or a mainstream brand. So hopefully a lot of the findings from this study will resonate with you, even if you're not necessarily in a retail business at the moment. So what is this big trend that we should be sort of looking out for? Now, retail, as you will all know, or the business of running shops in the old world, has traditionally been a very local business. So typically, retailers open stores in a particular country, and consumers used to shop from those retail organizations. And what we're seeing today is a fundamentally different world of retail, which is much more international and getting there much faster. So on this sort of chart here, you'll see the world's top 10 retailers. And I think there are at least 3 interesting things to take out of the data on this page. First of which is, in the top 10, 2 of the top 10 retailers in the world are actually pure play businesses. So both Amazon and eBay now make it to the top 10 and actually have a market capitalization that is, for example, Amazon is thrice as large as that of Tesco, which is the world's 3rd largest retailer. So some, quite interesting. But even more interesting for us was just the speed with which these 2 businesses have gone international. So typically in the more sort of traditional world of bricks and mortar retailers, so take someone like a Walmart, took 35 years for Walmart to get to roughly 30% of their sales from overseas, from outside of the US. And contrast that to Amazon and eBay, who within the span of a few years actually have got to nearly half or over half of their revenues from overseas. And you might say, well, Amazon and eBay are both sort of, extreme examples. But as we'll just go on to show you, we've interviewed a number of retail businesses of all scales and sizes. And actually, this whole trend around being able to internationalize at a much faster pace and be able to sort of generate majority of your revenue, not from your domestic market, but from your international market, is a theme that we're seeing really kind of on the rise. So we think e-commerce is shaping or reshaping the whole dynamic of retail. And we expect that in the next decade, actually the world will look at retail as a much more global and international industry than a local one. And kind of what's the state of the nation of UK players? And before we go on to the players, let's start, because all of this trend really starts with consumers. And the reason this is happening is because consumers are now searching overseas. So The first chart there is sort of really shows the growth rate of searches onto UK retailers from overseas. And I think, again, there are sort of very interesting things going on here. First of all, the growth rate of search terms from international consumers are actually growing at 46%, and that's twice as fast as domestic search growth. So actually, we're in a world where there's more search coming from overseas into the UK. That growth rate of that search is far outpacing domestic search growth. And it'll be really interesting when you go back to your businesses, actually, for you to dig into that and see what sort of patterns do you see within your business. And then on the right-hand side, all of this search, which, by the way, is coming from all of the countries around the world. So it's coming from Europe, but it's also coming from North America, Asia, Australia, and a whole load of other countries. And on the right-hand side, it's not that consumers are just searching, they're shopping as well. So when you look at countries like Cyprus, Ireland, Malta, over 3/4 of customers in those countries have shopped from a UK website. And even when you look at, the French, 30% of the French have shopped at a UK site. I don't know how you felt about those stats, but when we first sort of came across them, actually, that sounds like a pretty staggering number, because typically the French, for example, tend to be quite sort of nationalistic in terms of where their spend goes. So clearly, there's a lot of cross-border searching and spending going on. And why is this? The fact is that actually UK retailers have done a fantastic job of gearing up to this opportunity. So this is looking at the top 100 retailers or websites in the UK and looking at their international capability from the perspective of, do they ship outside of the UK and how many languages do they offer? And again, paints a somewhat surprising picture, which is 3/4 are shipping to more than 5 countries. And in fact, 40% of UK retailers are shipping to 40 plus countries. So actually UK retailers are starting to be on the front foot in terms of shipping overseas. And actually they're also getting pretty fit in terms of being able to translate into multiple languages. Clearly, German, French, Spanish tend to be the key languages that we're translating into at the moment, but Russian, Chinese, so clearly we're seeing some of the other languages also starting to gain traction. So again, a good picture of, on the one hand, consumer readiness, but on the other hand, supply side readiness and retailers really gearing up to make the most of this opportunity. The interesting pattern, though, and typically in a lot of markets, you might expect that the biggest companies were the first to internationalize. And if you look at, say, the FMCG industry sort of worldwide, you'd probably expect the larger businesses to be going international. The fantastic news story here is actually that when you look at it from the perspective of e-commerce, the smaller businesses, typically sub 25 million turnover, are actually grasping the international opportunity far more. So nearly half of their search traffic is coming from overseas. And as you start to go to some of the bigger retailers, the percentage tails off. So actually, again, it seems to point to that in this instance, a lot of the smaller businesses have just grasped the opportunity much more rapidly and have gone after it. We went on, we're fans of league tables because we think that's an interesting way of just bringing quite a lot of data together. And so using some heavily indexed and anonymized Google data, we've constructed what we call the jewels of this Britain's retail empire that's being re-established in many ways. You're not going to be able to read all of them, but I will sort of call a few out. So these are the top 50 international stars. So these are businesses that we see that are growing rapidly. They've achieved material proportions of their traffic and revenues from overseas. And I'd particularly like to call out, so clearly we're all familiar with the success stories of ASOS, Net-a-Porter, Wiggle, all businesses that have over 50% of their search and indeed their revenues from overseas. And I'm sure you're familiar with the stories of these 3 businesses, which are quite well profiled over the years. And they're all 3 sort of excellent businesses in their respective segments. But actually, there's a whole host of other businesses that are snapping at their heels. And there's an interesting cluster around a business called Farfetch. Who's aware of Farfetch? Number 2 on our index. Anyone want to describe what Farfetch do?
Marketplace for local boutiques.
Exactly right. So marketplace for local luxury boutiques from around the world. So if you want to buy that suit from a single store in Verona, you probably end up in Farfetch. Feel Unique, a beauty specialist, a brand aggregator in beauty. Corsets UK, this was a fantastic business that we stumbled into. They do, they do what their name says. They make corsets. And they originally started with the anticipation of basically shipping corsets to customers in the UK. It was quite easy for them to ship overseas, and they suddenly realized they're getting a whole host of traffic from Central and Eastern Europe and a lot of other markets where there seems to be a lot of pent-up demand for corsets. So suddenly this business, which has got a small business in the Midlands, has now become a rapidly growing international operation. And then Isabella Oliver, which is a sort of premium maternity clothing brand as well, again finds sort of really good traction in America, starting to focus on Australia, France and Germany as well. So again, quite a lot of these sort of small entrepreneurial businesses, but rapidly sort of growing at 20, 30, 40%. And then, of course, you have, and not to forget, the key scale established bricks and mortar businesses, so the likes of Burberry, Harrods, Specsavers, Holland and Barrett. So this is a whole range of industries and spectrums. This isn't just about luxury, which we know luxury travels very, very well, but actually there are a whole host of other categories as well where consumers from around the world are seeking out UK retail brands. And these are just 4 examples of businesses that are bricks and mortar, and they do ship internationally, but actually their whole traction in terms of customer awareness overseas is pretty substantial. So again, a number of sort of really exciting businesses and brands. What does it all mean? So in terms of sales opportunity, and this is sort of a kind of forecast that we specifically constructed for this study. And it's really come together using a combination of data sources. So using actual shipment parcel data, which we got from a company called MetaPack, also using a lot of the company interviews we did, and then internal benchmarks that both Google and OC&C would have. In 2012, international was around 14% of total e-commerce. So overall e-commerce, which is excluding food in the UK, was around 24 billion, and international was 4 billion. But when we start to look at the run rate and the trajectory that a lot of these businesses are and the trajectory of search growth, we're expecting that to be 40% and worth 28 billion. So if you're a brand today that's largely focused in the UK, you can nearly expect to double your business by capitalizing on the international opportunity. And in fact, in a lot of these markets, a number of the CEOs we interviewed felt that the reason UK brands are doing really well in these markets is they're fundamentally very strong propositions, and actually the competitive landscape in the UK is pretty robust. So when you take that robust proposition and you expose it to a lot of other markets where competition might be weaker, actually British brands will tend to win hands down. So when you look at, say, the proposition of Wiggle and you compare it to the local cycle brands in Australia, Japan, etc., actually the Wiggle proposition probably stacks up and is more advantaged than local players. And that, we think, is fundamentally going to drive a much higher growth rate for UK retailers from international sales. Clearly, domestic e-commerce is going to continue to be in growth. So that story hasn't sort of played out, and there's still more growth to be had. But we expect international growth to outpace domestic growth. And I think a lot of the interviews, the CEOs we interviewed from the sort of page before, certainly kind of would corroborate that. And for a lot of them, a lot of those businesses, they're probably seeing already, in today's terms, around 40% of their sales coming from e-commerce. So we certainly think from a 2020 perspective, if anything, that's conservative.